Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Anne Verghese, and I'm a research intern at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. I extend a warm welcome to all to today's ICS Wednesday seminar titled Role of Critical Supply Chains in U.S China Relations and Implications for India. In contemporary times, the U.S China relations have been on a rocky path. The U.S. tariffs and Chinese export controls on raw materials have pushed the bilateral relations of these countries onto an increasingly escalatory path. The situation is complicated further by the Trump administration's move towards utilizing trade agreements with certain aligned partners like Malaysia and Cambodia in an attempt to curb China's ability to weaponize supply chain dependencies. This seminar will delve into the future of US China relations in this context and assess the potential implications for India. The speaker for today's seminar is Ms. Lauren Piper. She is a senior analyst at Rhodium Group, where her work focuses on trade and supply chain de-risking. She is currently a Motwani Jadeja Fellow at O.P. Jindal Global University. She holds a master's degree in public affairs from Princeton University and a bachelor's degree in international studies from American University. The chair for today's seminar is Mr. Santosh Pai. He is a dual qualified cross-border lawyer offering legal services to clients within the India-China corridor. He's currently a partner at Denton's Link Legal, an Indian law firm. His major research interests include India-China economic ties, comparative law and policy, and cross-cultural negotiations. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to ask all the participants to follow a few housekeeping rules. All participants shall be muted during the seminar. Questions may be posted in the chat box along with your name and affiliation. Alternatively, you may use the raise your hand option during the interactive session. You shall then be called upon to unmute yourself. Thank you. I now hand over to the chair. Over to you, Mr. Pai.
Thank you, Anne. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's edition of the Wednesday Seminar Series, which is the Institute of Chinese Studies flagship program, which has been running for almost 5 decades. Today's discussion, as Anne said, focuses on the role of critical supply chains in U.S.-China relationship, but also outside it because of the spillover impact it has across the world. It comes at a moment when supply chains have become central to questions of economic security. Supply chains have moved far beyond the realm of efficiency and cost considerations. They have, in fact, now become instruments of statecraft. And the role of legal tools, especially tariffs, export controls, and investment screening by United States, China, and many other countries have begun to reshape how global supply chains move across the world in various industries. These changes are particularly happening in industries which are relevant to India, including electronics, pharmaceuticals, critical minerals, clean energy technologies, and advanced manufacturing. This landscape presents for India a very complex set of trade-offs. On the one hand, India is presented with an opportunity to position itself as an alternative to China and attract some of these moving parts of supply chains. On the other hand, India also has to mitigate its dependency on China, with whom we have a huge trade deficit, which has grown in the last few years. And in the middle of all that, we have to cope with the geopolitics and diplomatic challenges that the big power competition is bringing to our doorstep. We are pleased to have Lauren Piper with us today to help us unpack some of these dynamics. Her work primarily focuses on economic security issues, trade flows, and the political economy of supply chains. Lauren, thank you for joining us. I now hand it over to you for initial remarks. You can take 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor for some question and answers. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for hosting me. It's such an honor to be part of such a storied institution with the Institute of Chinese Studies here. In my presentation today, I'm going to be making 4 main points, which I'll run through at the top, and then we'll get through the details. The first is, as many of you may very well know, the U.S.-China relationship over the past year has been on a rocky road. It's been characterized by these repeated ups and downs. Over time, the escalations have reached new heights. And we're currently in a period where the U.S. China relationship is in a reset. We're kind of in a temporary cooling off period, but this does not necessarily mean that the U.S. is taking a step back from efforts to ensure that, to protect its economic security, which is my second point, that, outside of the bilateral U.S. relationship with China, that the U.S. is actively looking to bolster its economic security, for example, through strengthening or creating alternative supplies of critical raw materials, reducing imports of Chinese content, and so on. These efforts to bolster economic security are really part of a broader strategy that the U.S. is developing to reshape global supply chains. The key goal here is to reduce vulnerability to Chinese export controls, while also strengthening U.S. competitiveness. But of course, these are huge ambitions, and it's going to be really an uphill battle for the United States because China is and remains, dominant across global supply chains. It has very efficient industrial clusters that make it competitive, and even some current economic dynamics that make it very, very hard to compete with. And so finally, we'll walk through all of that, and at the very end, I will run through some implications for India. So to get us started, I know the talk said I was going to explain some of the recent dynamics in U.S.-China relations, which of course have been very, very challenging. So shortly after President Trump came back into office, we saw the U.S. Relatively quickly moved to increase tariffs on China. This was before even Liberation Day, in which the whole world was targeted. President Trump and the Trump administration imposed a 10% tariff on China because of China's participation in the global fentanyl trade. These tariffs were ratcheted up in the early months of the year, and then of course raised even further on Liberation Day in early April. Which is when, we see pretty significant Chinese retaliation. So China, to no surprise, hits back with its tariffs of its own, and also looks to strengthen, cut off some of these supplies of rare earth materials. This has a pretty significant impact on global supply chains. And, after a little bit more tit for tat, we see both the U.S. and China agree to cool the tensions, to move some of these additional tariffs and export controls, and sit down in Geneva and hit this sort of temporary reset. And so this really, you can imagine, is the first sort of up and down on the roller coaster that was U.S.-China relations in 2025. But it did not end there. What we saw as we headed into the summer is a similar sort of escalatory process. The U.S. Going into the summer looks to impose some additional export controls on products like semiconductors and aerospace equipment heading to China, which China perceives as the U.S. reneging on the sort of agreement that they came to in Geneva. And so China retaliates by again cutting off supplies of certain critical raw materials. And this is obviously very important because China, while it may not have the sort of mining or the actual critical raw materials in its country, it is the dominant player in the processing of these materials and the manufacturing of these processed materials into magnets and other very critical products for a range of industries. And so these export controls that China has imposed, we're starting to feel the pressure at this point as we get into the summer. U.S. automakers are seeing significant slowdowns in their production. They can't produce cars because they're not able to access some of these materials. And so again, after continued tariff threats and export control threats, both sides agree to meet again. They meet in London and they meet again in Stockholm and come to this sort of reset period where they roll back some of these additionally aggressive measures. Now you may think, maybe after 2 rounds of these ups and downs in the relationship that the U.S. And China would have come to a stable agreement. But this is not what happens. As we enter into the fall of 2025, the U.S. looks to impose what were, had largely already been in the process, these restrictive measures. The The first was fees targeting Chinese ships. So if a Chinese ship was coming to dock in a U.S. port, the U.S. would impose a fee on them. And the U.S. is also looking at another way of expanding its export controls targeting China, something called the BIS 50% rule, which again, China sees as the U.S. reneging on previous commitments and re-escalating in the relationship. So in response, again, we see China threatened to further expand its restrictions on critical raw materials, and in a very expansive way. And this, raises huge concerns from countries, from policymakers and companies and manufacturers around the world, as we're in October. And so again, we see this kind of collective freak out. And then the US and China again agreed to meet first in Kuala Lumpur, and then Trump and Xi meet in South Korea, and both sides agreed to roll things back. So this is all to say that, over the past year, we've seen U.S. China relations really on this roller coaster where there's these repeated ups and downs. And we're currently in this sort of reset period where both sides have laid down their arms, so to speak, in terms of the tariffs and export controls. But really, it's a fragile and it's a dangerous balance that we're in right now. And it's fragile because, as we've seen over the past year, that, every time there's been 3 occasions in which, the U.S. has escalated, China has responded, and then they both agree to cool down the tensions. But that does not mean that, that doesn't preclude the tensions from re-escalating. And it's dangerous because each time we've seen an escalation where there's these ups and downs, the tensions have reached new heights. We've seen increased threatened tariffs. We've seen far more aggressive threatened export controls, all of which, could seriously threaten global production. So for this reason, I think that it's a significant risk as we look ahead into the next year, that U.S.-China relations could re-escalate again. We could see, for example, U.S. looking to raise tariffs. We could see China expanding its controls on critical raw materials, as the news, suggests that China is currently doing now with Japan. But largely, I think for this first quarter, the base case is that things are kind of going to remain on stable footing. And this is because Trump is planning to go to Beijing in April. And so things are largely in a good place for now. But this does not mean that the U.S. is, not going to seek to strengthen its economic security in other ways. Even if the U.S.-China bilateral relationship is on a sort of stable footing for right now, we still see the U.S. looking to increase its competitiveness and decrease its vulnerability to Chinese export controls and other forms of economic coercion outside of the bilateral relationship. We're really seeing this come to the forefront in the U.S. trade and other sort of multilateral negotiations. So this is, I think, coming up right now because, frankly, I think the U.S. was quite caught off guard in 2025 with China's response to U.S. tariffs. I think that especially the events of the first Trump administration made clear that China would retaliate. There would be some sort of tit for tat escalation when the U.S. imposed tariffs, like we saw in 2018. However, I think U.S. policymakers did not expect China to weaponize its control over the processing of rare earths and other critical raw materials to the extent that it did. And so this has really made U.S. policymakers in particular, and I think as a result also those in Brussels and Tokyo and elsewhere, very, very aware of the sort of risk of depending too much on China for these products. And so this is why the U.S. is still seeking to ensure it's, bolstering its economic security outside of the U.S.-China relationship. And the first way that we really see this happening is through U.S. attempts to develop alternative supplies of these rare earth minerals and other critical raw materials. You may have seen in the news earlier this week with the new U.S. ambassador to India, Sergio Gore here, that India has been invited to join Pax Silica. This is a multilateral initiative that the U.S. is pursuing with a number of other partners with the explicit goal of trying to create alternative supplies of these very important raw materials. Pax Silica is one of several multilateral arrangements in which the U.S. is working with allies to try to coordinate and create these alternative supplies. At home and domestically, we also see the U.S. Create under the Trump administration putting forward some pretty creative measures to reduce this vulnerability to Chinese economic coercion in this way. For example, by the U.S. government taking equity stakes in companies like MP Materials, offtake agreements, and even the consideration in partnership with the G7 of some price floors for certain critical raw materials to try to incentivize the creation of alternative supply chains. But of course, Chinese dominance across supply chains is not just limited to critical raw materials. It's in a much broader range of industries, and it's not just from products made in China. China's demonstrated as a result of this past year, it's willing to restrict the export of goods and materials to third countries that may produce very important items for the U.S. and its partners. And so as a result, we're also seeing the U.S. look through its trade negotiations to reduce the amount of Chinese content in products that eventually head towards the U.S. Now, I'll say compared to efforts to develop alternative supplies of critical raw materials, these efforts to reduce Chinese content in U.S. imports are, I think, still under development and really depend on the ways that the trade negotiations with other partners play out. But I'll walk through a few of the ways that the U.S. is thinking about doing this. You may have heard in the news, the Trump administration has officially imposed, but not actually collecting yet, what they're calling a transshipment tariffs. So basically trying to raise the tariff on a good that, say, was really made in China or almost fully made in China, perhaps shipped through Vietnam, given a made in Vietnam sticker, and then sent to the United States. So they're trying to do that as a way to sort of prevent this sort of transshipment or the import to the U.S. of products made in third countries, but with very little amount of that country's value add. Similar to this, there's been some talk of changes to rules of origin. This is a super wonky trade law issue, but the idea is that if the U.S. is going to give a lower tariff to a country, say Vietnam, compared to China, for example, that the product there should have mostly Vietnam content. It should not be, again, having mostly Chinese content that's assembled in Vietnam and sent to the United States. There's also talk of the U.S., and this was reported in negotiations, I know, in the U.S.-India trade negotiation of raising what we call regional value content requirements, all towards the same objective. It really depends on the ways that these trade negotiations play out, but all to say that the U.S. is looking to reduce Chinese content in its imports and taking a variety of different, considering a variety of different approaches to do this. Just two other ways that I'll flag that the U.S. is, pushing these economic security measures globally. The U.S. in trade deals announced with Malaysia and Cambodia. These are maybe, not nearly as big of countries as India, but these deals are really interesting because in them, the U.S. Has gotten these countries, on paper at least, to agree to aligning with the U.S. on a number of restrictions, including restrictions on Chinese investment in those countries. De facto, this is not exactly what the text says, but this is the intent. They're looking to encourage these countries to scrutinize Chinese investments that, from other countries that reduce U.S. imports or that lead to the U.S. Importing below market price goods and so on. So really trying to scrutinize Chinese investment in third markets, making sure that other countries are aligning on U.S. export controls. And just the last thing I'll mention here is that in addition to these efforts to develop alternative critical raw material supplies, reducing Chinese content in its imports, the U.S. is also looking to some sort of claw back some of these strategic assets from China. So you may have seen in the news, right? The Panama Canal is quite a big focus here, where the U.S. is concerned that China could weaponize Chinese companies or Chinese companies' stakes in critical infrastructure, particularly in the Western Hemisphere, which is of very high importance to the Trump administration. So they are looking to reclaim control of these assets in order to decrease vulnerability to Chinese economic coercion and reassert strategic control in those areas. So, it's been a very busy year in the sort of U.S. China relationship and also outside of it, right, with all of this pursuit of economic security measures. And what I'll say is that I think that these efforts, to bolster economic security are not just aiming to bolster U.S. economic security, but also feed into a broader strategy for the U.S. to reshape global supply chains. And I think that you can see this in particular with, the U.S. tariff structure that's emerging. Now, I will caveat this up front with saying that, of course, the U.S. tariff rates seem to be constantly changing. Trump has a tendency to threaten higher tariffs for a range of political objectives. We know this. Just this week, threatening an additional 25% tariff on countries that trade with Iran, or a 500% tariff on India last week, and the list goes on. But I think once you kind of get behind the headlines, you can see that there is a emerging U.S. strategy, so to speak, to reshape global supply chains through tariffs. And similar to the economic security provisions we're seeing in U.S. negotiations with its partners, these tariffs, I think, are also looking to reduce vulnerability to Chinese export controls by helping diversify these global supply chains. And so really there's like a sort of 5-tier structure here. The priority for these like global supply chain restructuring from the U.S. perspective is, as Trump would say, we want to make it in the United States. You get a 0% tariff if you make in the U.S. So first and foremost, the U.S. is looking to reshore some strategic sectors. The Trump administration has put a ton of pressure, for example, on advanced pharmaceutical companies to bring some manufacturing back to the United States. Of course, automotive, hugely politically important, also in focus in some advanced electronics. We're seeing this through primarily the imposition of what the U.S. calls Section 232 tariffs, with the idea being that these are sectors that are relevant to national security, which can be defined somewhat flexibly in the U.S. context, and therefore, we should try to produce some of these things in the United States. But of course, it's not possible for the United States to produce everything. We've got already. The labor market's quite tight. There's huge concerns about inflation. And so, realistically, the U.S. needs to work with other countries to diversify, friendshore, whatever you want to call it. And so if it's not reshoring, the top priority for the Trump administration is nearshoring. It's going to be bringing supply chains that maybe would have been in China before, primarily to the Western Hemisphere. And so the first priority is the United States' closest neighbors. It's going to be Mexico and Canada. These countries, actually have very, very low effective tariff rates at the moment because of exemptions through the U.S. trade deal with those countries. And then second to them is going to be other countries in the Western Hemisphere. I'll note that the U.S. National Security Strategy, which came out at the end of last year, makes very clear this intent to create alternative supply chains in the Western Hemisphere, because the U.S. sees these as more that it can control these supply chains much better. And as part of that, right, the U.S. needs to has this ambition to reduce the Chinese influence in the region and build up alternative supply chains. So again, starting with reshoring, that's the top priority. Then it's nearshoring. And then we get to the other sort of trade partners. So the next priority is the countries with a 15% reciprocal tariff rate. These are the U.S.'s closest political and national security allies. So the European Union, Japan, South Korea, for example. Following them is when we get to South and Southeast Asia, around with 19 to 20% reciprocal tariff rates. Though I'll note that many of these countries are getting exemptions as they're starting to sign and get through the trade deal process. So the tariff rate is effectively coming down, especially in some critical sectors like in electronics. And Malaysia's received some exemptions for that. And as other countries get to their trade deals with the U.S., I think there's a possibility that we could see exemptions for other sectors. Which then finally brings us to China, which, I think is the goal of the U.S. trade strategy. In addition to, well, there's many goals, right? The U.S. is looking to raise revenue, it's looking to reshore, but it's also looking to diversify away from China. So China right now, since the beginning of last year, of course, everything has been up and down, right? But at the moment has an additional 20% tariff that gets layered on top of a bunch of other restrictions and tariffs the U.S. had imposed beforehand. So the idea here is to try to incentivize supply chain shifts out of China by decreasing the relative cost compared to China via tariffs to produce first and foremost in the U.S., then the Western Hemisphere, very close allies like the EU and Japan, and then in Southeast Asia. Now, I have not mentioned, right, India. This is the big question. It's obviously challenging given that this trade strategy has been, part also infused with some of these more political objectives, or other foreign policy objectives, like with Iran or migration or fentanyl and so on, which is obviously a huge impediment. So, but the expectation is largely that India's, the trade negotiations that the U.S. and India are currently in are progressing well, and that India and U.S. officials have said that India has given, its best offer to the United States that it ever has before. And so, I think that there's a huge risk when people, analysts over the past year have made when they, say that the trade deal is going to be done by a certain date. The date just keeps getting pushed, frankly. But it does seem like the situation is optimistic, particularly with the new U.S. ambassador on the ground. And the expectation is that India, once there is a U.S. India trade deal, it's likely going to fall somewhere between where, the very closest U.S. allies are at 15%, right, where the EU, Japan, South Korea are, and the sort of 19-20% rate that countries that the U.S. has gotten deals with in South and Southeast Asia are. So somewhere in between there, which I think could lead to some reshoring or supply chain diversification in India. But of course, I've spent the last 20 minutes or so walking through the U.S.'s the Trump administration's sort of grand plans, all of the goals to reduce U.S. dependence on Chinese critical raw materials, reduce U.S. vulnerability to Chinese export controls and other forms of economic coercion, and these big goals of diversifying global supply chains. But this is not going to be easy, and not easy whatsoever, because as we know very well, China is dominant in these global supply chains, and not just for critical raw materials, right? We see China dominant across supply chains all the way from the raw materials to the intermediate goods to the finished products. I will not bore you with stats. I'll just give you one. The one thing that we like to note is that, China accounts for 35% of global production, even though it, which is far above its, 18 or 19% share of global GDP. So it's really punching above its weight. And it's, everyone knows this, right? Like China is an absolutely spectacular manufacturing power. It's like many advanced economies that came before it, it has moved progressively from lower complexity to higher complexity products. But what's notable is that it hasn't let go of, unlike other developed countries, which, kind of moved up the ladder, China has just kind of taken up the whole thing. And it's continued to be dominant in like lower complexity products while it's, being a bigger producer and exporter of the higher end goods. And this is quite notable because, China's labor costs are rising. And so most people would expect in that, with that dynamic, that some of the supply chains would shift. And of course that they have on the margin, right? Like we're seeing some, driven by some of the labor costs, particularly in, for example, like in apparel, some growth or some decrease in China's share of final production in those products. because of the labor cost dynamic. But by and large, China's able to offset these higher labor costs because its production system is just so good and so efficient. It's developed these industrial clusters that are make it very easy to do business. It's highly innovative when you have all these different suppliers and the assemblers in one place. And it just has the scale where it can produce so much at such a low cost that it's very, very hard to compete with. And plus, it's highly stable. It's an easy place to do business. A lot of companies already have a presence there. So China really has a ton of advantages, just on the basis of its existing manufacturing ecosystem. And so this is just extremely hard to compete with, right? Any country that's trying to create an alternative to China, they have to find a way. How can we drive down the cost of production or make it easier so that we can attract some of these companies that maybe produce in China but would like to have a China plus one or shift their supply chains. So that alone makes it hard. I'll add that I think that China has expressed a strategic interest in blocking these sort of diversification and de-risking moves. If you look back, there was a really interesting speech by the former MIT head back in February of 2024, where he clearly articulates how China having every stage of industrial production, from these sort of like lower complexity or primary sectors all the way up to the most advanced EVs, robotics, and so on, having everything all in one place gives China this incredible sort of of course, it makes it easier to produce and innovate, but it's also very important to its national power. And we've seen this, right? Like the fact that China has these supply chains has given it significant leverage over the United States and other countries over the past year when the U.S., for example, looks to impose tariffs. So China really wants to maintain these sorts of dependencies for that sort of national strategic interest. And of course, I have to mention that these sort of manufacturing industries, many of which they're export oriented. And this is important in the China context because of just how much exports contribute to China's economic growth. Rhodium Group does a ton of work estimating looking at China's economic outlook. And our assessment of 2025 suggests that exports actually contributed to between 56 and 68% of China's GDP growth. So if you see, some of this manufacturing moving out of China, it could have a negative effect, right, on China's exports and therefore on a great deal of employment and it's China's economic growth. So very, very important for China to block de-risking measures to try to maintain its control over these strategic supply chains. And I think, this is why we've seen over the past few years, China taking increasingly aggressive steps to block diversification. So, of course, you can put the sort of export controls on critical raw materials into this bucket. But I think it goes beyond that. There's been reporting in Bloomberg, for example, that MOFCOM in China has, summoned a variety of different companies and to tell them very explicitly, do not move your supply chains out of China. There was a report on this, I think, like in all sorts of industries, right? Like from Shein fast fashion to BYD and the Chinese EV makers. And MOFCOM is telling them don't move your manufacturing, but if you have to, then only move your final assembly. Do not move the sort of key components that because we want to first of course maintain those for our own economic growth and so on, but also because of the strategic interest in having them. And we see this in other ways too, right? Like the reported restrictions on Foxconn engineers going from China to India, and so on. So, China has really taken these increasingly aggressive measures to block diversification, which are gonna, I think we'll see kind of increase over the coming years as the U.S., looks to reduce its vulnerability to these restrictions by creating alternative supplies and all the other things that we've discussed so far. So maybe I'll get to, conclude here with just some implications for India. First, I'll say that, I think all else equal, it's going to get harder for India and other countries to attract China plus one investment. And this is, first and foremost because of dynamics in China's domestic economy. So right now we're seeing pretty significant producer price deflation in China, which has contributed to weakness in China's RMB. This, of course, supports makes it cheaper to produce in China and makes it more attractive for Chinese exports. So all else equal, even if we didn't see China, taking these more aggressive steps to block diversification, those economic dynamics alone are going to make it increasingly hard for countries to attract China plus one investment. Of course, we've seen some success, particularly in India on the margins. So for example, we see, incredible growth in Apple's production of iPhones in India, and so much so that at least in the U.S. context, it's incredible that almost all Apple products sold in the U.S. are coming from are being made in India. So this is, very, very notable, and I think largely driven by the geopolitics. But by and large, I think by most measures, India has really underperformed so far when it comes to this China plus one investment. So in the near term, given China's attractiveness for manufacturing and exports and all of this, and its willingness, right, to take some more aggressive steps to block these sort of ex-China supply chain investments. If India wants to attract investment in this sort of regard, it's going to have to probably do some more to improve the ease of doing business. I know that there's been, and this is actually, I'm here in India doing a ton of conversations on this. I know that India has done an excellent job over the past 10 years of making it easier for companies that want to manufacture here, including through offering the production-linked incentives and so on. But it's going to have to, India and every other country looking to shore up their supply chains is going to have to confront, these the dynamics in China's economy that are going to make it harder to attract investment and find a way to bridge the gap. This talk, thinking about China plus one investment, to me raises the question, and this will get to my second implication for India, on Chinese foreign direct investment in India. So I understand that several news reports have suggested that India is considering easing some restrictions on Chinese investment. And I think this is particularly interesting when it comes to supply chains, because our research at Rhodium Group shows that when supply chains have moved to date, often they're doing so with Chinese companies in the lead. So it's not necessarily true that is going to be what would happen if India eases restrictions. Obviously, we have to see if India eases the restrictions and how that may look in the end. But it could lead to the development of greater supplier ecosystems. So helping India move from maybe the final assembly up to some sort of like more component manufacturing and so on. And in the long run, right, if China's main point of competitiveness in global supply chains is the fact that it has these productive, very efficient industrial clusters. If India can bring in some of the more component manufacturing and so on, it could in the long run make India more competitive. Of course, if China lets these companies invest in India. And I'll raise just one more implication for India, and I would love to get to Q&A. And this is on really the India-China trade relationship. I think that, I saw that over the last year, India has imported a record amount from China. The Indian trade deficit with China has reached new heights. And I think, for 2026, I think we should expect that this trade deficit will grow. And this is going to be primarily because of the Chinese deflation, which is also leading to, right, the RMB weakness, which makes Chinese exports more attractive. But second, and very important here, as we've seen, with the U.S. raising trade barriers with other countries, even the EU, Mexico, considering raising trade barriers to Chinese goods, Chinese exporters are having to look for alternative markets. So we've seen growth, for example, in Chinese exports to Thailand and some other Southeast Asian countries as a result of this. Pretty significant growth in exports to the Middle East, quite notable over the past year. And so, India with, some of the fastest growing global economy. It's going to be hugely attractive for Chinese exporters. And so I think if they are given the opportunity, they will try to boost their exports to India, which could deepen the sort of Indian trade deficit with China. So, and I will say, I think that in the near term, this is going to continue even if China builds up, or sorry, even if India builds up more manufacturing. And this is because, right now, India, like many other South and Southeast Asian countries, is mainly doing the final assembly and still importing many of the components from China. And so, like we've seen in the ASEAN case, that Chinese exports that those countries are booming as a result of this imports to ASEAN of Chinese components. So really need to watch for those dynamics in the India-China trade relationship. And one thing I'll be curious for in the coming years is, if India takes a similar path to other countries like Mexico in terms of raising its own trade barriers to Chinese imports, because just of this, imperative strategically of reducing vulnerability to China's export controls, but also, because all countries want to have the sort of manufacturing to protect their economies from Chinese overcapacity and so on. So I think that's definitely something to watch, and would be actually very curious for any opinions on that. I will conclude there. I thank you so much. I hope that this has been useful, talking about the U.S.-China relationship, all the ways the U.S. is trying to bolster its economic security with partners, and as part of the strategy to reshape global supply chains. And I'm very much looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Lauren. I think you did a formidable job considering US China is where your comfort lies. I think you pushed yourself to put some Indian perspective there, but thank you. That was good to hear, and you covered a lot of ground. Uh, and I will just, start with a few questions to on what you have said about US China before moving to the India piece. Now, you said there's been a lot of volatility between US, China. You talked about Geneva, London, Stockholm, and so on. So now, and you also ended by saying, there's a meeting coming up in April. So do you see this process culminating in a grand bargain and then some stability? Because, as a neutral country observer, big power competition can be volatile. It could continue, but when you're talking about supply chains, certainty is what we're looking for. So I just want you to reflect on whether the uncertainty will continue between US and China, and if so, what happens to all these other deals that US is stitching up with partner countries, as you put it, Malaysia, Cambodia? Will those remain stable, or will that volatility reflect in those deals? Because eventually, for either of them to be effective, there has to be certainty. So that's my first question. Do you see all these spillover effects also stabilizing at some point? Because you said economic security for the US is a long-term goal. So no matter what happens with China, it will pursue some of these things. So does that mean it is more stable than US-China ties? That's my first question. Now, second question is on, we didn't touch upon it in so much detail. So I'm just asking you to maybe dig a little deeper. When we say critical supply chains, by definition, it could mean different things for different countries.
Mhm.
So, how much of this is dictated by the US in its discussions with other countries, non-China countries? Is critical for US meaning what US wants, or is there a halfway kind of definition here? Because there are a lot of things which other countries might deem critical because it generates jobs and generates investments and technology and so on. Or is it a unilateral definition? How are these definitions developing? Some of them are obvious. I'm not asking about the most obvious ones, but is there a framework to look at criticality? Because this has been a sort of question for debate in India recently, because we are looking to ease FDI, public procurement, and so on. So, what is critical? So, maybe you can reflect on that. My third question, and after this, I'll give you some time to respond before moving on to other questions, is does US offer any kind of assistance in terms of funding or other kind of technology support when it negotiates with other countries to help them attract supply chains away from China? Or is it just the lever of tariffs? So is it just using tariffs, or is there something plus, plus, plus? It could be loans, it could be equity, it could be some other kind of technology support. So I'm really keen to know, without speculating into the contours of the India-US deal, which is under negotiation, I want to maybe ask you to reflect on what could it be? What are the carrots that US is offering apart from just lower tariffs, which you already said is between 15 to 20%, somewhere in that spot between Western European countries and Southeast Asian countries. So these are my three questions. Maybe you can take them one by one while we wait for others in the chat box. Otherwise, I have a dozen more questions for you. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you. These are fantastic and huge questions. I'll start with your first one. You asked, do I expect to see a U.S. China grand bargain? And I think that this really depends on how you define a grand bargain. And I'm not trying to avoid your question. But this kind of goes back to the first Trump administration. So in the Trump administration back in 2018 through 2020, the U.S. imposed a variety of tariffs on China with the goal of getting China to open up its market. Like the U.S. was primarily concerned about fixing the sort of imbalances in the U.S.-China trade relationship where, the U.S. has a huge trade deficit. And so back in 2020, the U.S. reached what they called the phase one trade deal with China, in which China was going to buy huge quantities and values of things like U.S. energy and agricultural products. But this obviously did not come to fruition. President Trump was out of office. And so, I think that, maybe people kind of stopped paying attention to it, but China did not meet its commitments. And this is fundamentally a result of the sort of imbalances in China's domestic economy that lead to these sort of global spillovers. And so, do I think the U.S. and China are going to reach a grand bargain? I think that Trump has a interest in having, the photo op. He wants to have a handshake with Xi. He wants to be able to put on Truth Social that the U.S. has done it. The U.S. has gotten a great deal with China. It has fixed everything in the relationship. I think that we might get a grand bargain in that sense. But when it comes down to sort of economic fundamentals, I'm highly skeptical that we're going to, if you think back to the first Trump administration, that some sort of trade deal is going to solve these dynamics, these fundamental imbalances of the U.S.-China relationship, because they pertain to the fundamental imbalances in China's domestic economy, which China has shown it's not particularly willing to address. On this, what is sort of impact on the broader tariff uncertainty? Again, I think that Trump, and maybe even ahead of the U.S. midterm elections that are coming up this year, is going to want to be able to claim victory. Tariffs are pretty unpopular in the United States, and so economic issues like affordability is a huge issue. So I imagine that Trump is going to want to come to some sort of get to the handshake, to the photo op sooner than later. But I think the U.S. is going to pursue a range of different strategies, even if it's not through tariffs, through things like broad-based bans on certain Chinese technologies. And so I think that there will be some uncertainty in the U.S.-China economic relationship in that sense going forward because of the sort of fundamental competitive nature of the relationship. The impact on partners, if the U.S. reaches a grand bargain with China, I think I really think that the U.S. trade talks with China in many ways are delinked from partner countries. I think that, the U.S., maybe that, it's one of the ways that China retaliated against the United States has been by reducing some of its purchases of U.S. agricultural products, particularly soybeans. And so this, I think in the U.S. has raised the relative importance of getting some agricultural market access commitments as part of other trade deals, which is very hard with certain countries like India, right? But I really don't think that, for example, I don't think that if the U.S. gets a trade deal with China, that it would be less interested in getting a trade deal with India. They're very much all very important. To your second question on what constitutes a critical supply chain. I think that yes, a critical supply chain is different for all countries. And actually, I'm working with my team right now to do a sort of comprehensive mapping of what, for example, like what does the U.S. State are its critical sectors for de-risking, or the EU, right? A lot of countries have these sorts of lists. They change quite frequently. And then if you can kind of pair those up with the sort of sectors that maybe a country like India is targeting in its PLI schemes or other sort of ways to either bring in investment or reduce its vulnerabilities. And of course they differ. I think that there's kind of two ways, and you alluded to this when you're asking the question, that you can determine what is a critical supply chain. The first is going to be like anything that's pertaining to sort of critical infrastructure or national security. Which it actually can be quite broad. So you can think of like what are like just the absolute fundamental needs that your country, like that, for example, if there was conflict, that you know that you're going to need to have medicines for your people, like you know that you need to be able to have running water and the energy system running, like you know that you're going to need to be able to make weapon systems, all of those things that are very, very important to just like the basic running of your country. This leaves aside a lot of things, like for example, like U.S. policymakers will say like, yeah, well, maybe we don't, like it would be fine if we don't have like apparel imports for a little bit, like or maybe we don't even need the next, like for example, like you could wait a little bit for like the next iPhone. But there's a lot of different ways that a supply chain could be critical. And of course, this gets to the job piece. In the U.S. context, the automotive sector really comes to mind. It's very politically important. I think there are absolutely huge overlaps between automotive production and this sort of more national security sphere. But the sort of desire to protect jobs is absolutely crucial here. And so I think that you see this in debates coming up in India and elsewhere in terms of like, how do you determine which sectors to maintain the protections on, because you don't want to expose huge swaths of your population, of your workers in your economy to very intense Chinese competition, which at times may be aided by subsidies or just the sheer dominance of China's manufacturing system. And so I think that in the trade negotiations, on tariffs in particular, the critical supply chain talks, I think, are dictated by the U.S. because the U.S. has gone through with these sort of Section 232 tariffs, and impose these higher tariffs and is negotiating rates down on sectors that it seems as critical to its national security, like drones or solar panels, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors. There's like 14, it's either 12 or 14 sectors that are subject to these tariffs right now. And so in the current trade negotiations, I think those are top of mind because the U.S. is offering exemptions to those for countries it sees as aligned partners. So in that way, the sort of critical supply chains, I think, are the talk of shoring up critical supply chains are maybe dictated by the U.S. But I think any country, when it's going to come to these negotiations, is gonna have a good understanding of its own domestic economy, of the sectors that it wants to protect jobs in from foreign competition. And so I imagine these aren't just, the U.S. isn't the only isn't the only player at the table. So of course I think other countries are. I would expect that they're also bringing in their own considerations. And the third question, how does the U.S. Look to diversify its supply chains? Is it just tariffs? I think first and foremost, the U.S. has looked to diversify supply chains by leveraging the size of its domestic market. So tariffs are absolutely one part of that, but we see it in a range of other ways. So for example, a few years ago, the U.S. offered some subsidies for people who are buying electric vehicles. And basically, if you were going to be able to get that subsidy, the car maker would have to make sure that, a certain percentage of the battery or other parts of the vehicle didn't have Chinese content or, content from countries of concern. There's similar sort of restrictions on ways that the U.S. is tried to cut off its market to Chinese producers. So for example, there's a tool called the ICTS restrictions. These are information and communications and technologies and services. It is an absolute mouthful, but basically gives the US the ability to cut off any transaction, very much, including sales into the United States of products made by a Chinese entity. And this is important because, if a manufacturer is looking to wants to serve into the U.S. market, which in most sectors is the biggest market, right? So you want to be able to serve that. You want to make sure that you can, meet the requirements to enter the U.S. market. In terms of like carrots, the U.S. is offering other countries. I mean, the tariff rate is the primary tool. I mean, tariffs are top of mind for Trump. And they're a very, I think, kind of easy thing to negotiate on, right? You can kind of set the rate, you can see where they are relative to other countries. It's pretty simple. Though the US has talked about using other tools. And so I'll link back to the national security strategy released at the end of the year, where the U.S. and this was in particular in the section on the Western Hemisphere. So the U.S. is saying it wants to build these supply chains in the Western Hemisphere. How do we do that? And tariffs, of course, are one tool, but you also need to help support the creation of the domestic ecosystem. So some offers potentially of financing through the U.S. Development Finance Corporation. And this is not like the U.S. necessarily going and building a factory, but the DFC will go in and, for example, build roads from the factory to the port. They'll kind of support the construction of infrastructure in other ways. And so this is, the DFC it's a long existing organization within the U.S. government, but really under this Trump administration has this objective and mandate to go and kind of support these supply chain diversification measures. Really making sure that what it's funding is advancing U.S. strategic interests. So, those are just a few tools. Though I will say the Trump administration has shown a willingness and ability to create use some creative tools. So we could see some other tools come down the line, and it would definitely be interesting to watch.
Thank you, Lauren. So now I'll just pick up on a popular school of thought in India, which goes as follows: that after 5 years, India is now warming up to China or restarting economic dialogue with China because the US has been very unfair to India in terms of tariffs and so on. So I want to ask your perspective on this. Does US see India in the same bracket as China, or do you think there's a linkage here of some sort? Because if US wants to do a deal with China, will that diminish India's chances, or do you actually believe India stands on its own footing? Because there is this domestic thinking in India that we will warm up to China now because US has not given us a fair deal. And partly linked to this question is also about India's leverage. Now, just as you said, US uses its domestic market or purchasing capacity as leverage with China. India also has potential leverage. We have a large consumption story, which is, with increasing income levels and, with, as you said, the fastest growing large economy in the world and so on. So India fancies its chances at attracting China plus one supply chains. And for a moment, let's assume that we will start approving Chinese investments because otherwise it's not going to work. I think last 5 years have proved it. So do you think India stands a chance of converting its vulnerability into leverage, just as the US is doing? Because it's no different, right? So if the US has the largest market today, it can be argued that India has a large potential market 10 years from now. Or we have a large public procurement market, which accounts for 20% of the GDP. So I'm just trying to unpack what you said and look at it from the US perspective. So, how do these two questions sit alongside your understanding currently? Thank you.
Great questions. I mean, I think I'll start. So you asked, does the US see India in the same sort of bracket as China? Would a US-China deal diminish the interest in a US-India deal? I think absolutely not. Over the past 5 years, it's absolutely true that the US has deepened its cooperation with India because it sees India as a key partner in this long-term strategic competition with China. We see this, through increased engagement through the Quad, through the creation of the Biden administration of the ISET, which is now turned into the Trust. So yes, U.S.-China tensions have, I think, deepened U.S.-India relations. But the US, I think, is still very interested in striking a trade deal with India, for exactly the reasons you mentioned. India's economy is growing and growing quite fast. And obviously China is a huge market and very important for US companies and for the US economy, but US companies are also getting squeezed out of the market. China's economic growth is slowing. It's not going to be nearly as high as India's, and especially in the coming years. And so, I think that the US is going to pursue that sort of trade agreement with India, regardless of how things go with China. I think, I've also heard this sort of threat, that if the US continues to be so unfair towards India, that India is going to have to warm up to China. And I think that, the one thing to caution for here is that, the US and China are like completely different. The nature of India's relationship with those two countries is completely different. And and you can see this in the trade statistics, right? Like it's hard to imagine, China offering the same sort of market opportunities as the US does. And so, I think that this is a dynamic to critically consider when thinking about the sort of trade-offs and India's relationship with China and the US. Which, kind of gets to your third question. Can India leverage access to its own market? I think that, I've been in India for a few weeks now and talking with a bunch of people in government, but also in the private sector. And, it seems to be that, companies, everyone has been is very starry-eyed about India, about this sort of, 8.2% GDP growth, about, this massive population, very young, excited, like huge opportunities here. The one thing I'll caution is that, when I speak with people who've been in India for a long time or companies that have been operating here, there's still this sort of like, India, it would be great. It has all these great things on paper, but sometimes can be so hard to do business here. And so this, yes, I think India could leverage this market, but there's also this issue where I think some, foreign companies, right, that whose interests the foreign governments are representing feel like they can't really access it sometimes. So they can't be part of this Indian growth story as much as they would want to. So I think that, yes, India can leverage this market, but, it would actually be it could more effectively leverage it if it was in some ways opened up market access in some cases. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Lauren. Yes, I think you have addressed it. I'll now take a few questions from the chat box. I think they're being routed from the YouTube channel. It's suggested that the curbs announced in October by China are indeed the final goal, one way or the other, despite moratorium of the year of 1 year. How true is that? So, is that the weaponization of export controls, technology, export? Is that the end goal? Is it inevitable, or is this 1 year moratorium going to be extended? I suppose is the question. So, quick reflections.
Yeah, so I mean,
One more. Sorry, I'm sorry. There's one more. Sorry,
okay.
let's just take two at a time to make
Yeah.
it efficient. Is India in a position to adopt a more confrontational trade posture with US, somewhat similar to China, to negotiate better terms, or would India lose the critical technology transfers? Okay, I think this is self-evident. Maybe you've touched upon it, but you can just summarize it nicely again. Thank you. These two questions will be good.
Yeah, so on the first question, in terms of China's willingness or what it plans to do with these sort of controls on critical raw materials. So for a long time, the kind of consensus thinking was that, China had these, it has this massive leverage over the processing of rare earth and other critical raw materials, and that in some ways, it would kind of not want to threaten it too much, because if you threaten to restrict access to these technologies, it's only going to incentivize other countries to create alternative supplies, which is exactly what we're seeing right now. And if those other countries succeed in creating alternative supplies, and actually reduces the potency of your leverage, so then you can't really use that tool as much. And so you're completely right that China agreed with the U.S. To put a pause on its most aggressively threatened export controls on critical raw materials for a year from now. But I think that what we'll see is that China is going to continue. Even though it said that it's put these things on pause, it's continuing to selectively and go carefully review the sort of applications for the export of these products. And so this is why we see, a slowdown in some of these exports from China to Japan in recent weeks. So I imagine that, China's going to continue to be selective about this and continue to use this as a point of leverage. But if we may get to a point, right, where China it's the issue of like, do you cut off the exports so that you can like maximize your leverage, or do you kind of allow the flow here and there to sort of stall or make it harder to create alternative supplies? So I think that if I were in Beijing, in a year from now, I would probably continue this sort of like stop and go, very selective application of export controls, but while still allowing some exports to flow. But and what we've seen to date, and I think what will continue, is that China's going to be watching very closely to make sure that other countries aren't building stockpiles. This is the first thing you can think of if you're not able to, if China's cutting off your access to these things and it's going to take a few years to develop alternative supplies, the first thing you're going to try to do is just like try to stockpile as much as possible. So they're going to try to prevent that. But I think that there's going to be China's going to take several steps to try to block the creation of alternative supplies, and so allowing some exports in some cases could be part of that. On the second question, in terms of if India could take a more confrontational trade posture with the U.S., I think that India could, but India doesn't have the same level. Like, so for example, like China has responded to U.S. tariffs by, it raised tariffs on certain products. It also, more significantly, right, it imposed these controls on critical raw materials. So India could try to do something similar, though I don't think, like the Indian market is not necessarily as important, right, to the U.S. And by and large, like the U.S. is a huge net importer. So even in that sense, that the U.S. is de facto, the U.S. weaponizing access to its market for the U.S. is going to be, I think, more important than other countries trying to weaponize access to its market. So, I will kind of leave it at that.
Thank you, Lauren. I think we have two more questions. The first one being, with Beijing weaponizing midstream semi-choke points against U.S. tariffs, how might India convert rare steel byproducts, neon refining, into geoeconomic leverage, demanding Chinese JV technology for end-user pacts, while critiquing dual hegemonies to build autonomous backward linkages for EV? So I suppose it's like a quid pro quo. I think, can India demand Chinese technology in exchange for market access to India? That's how I read it. If you remove the references to the industry, I hope I'm right, Shreyansh. And the second question is, amid US-India ambitions to establish India as a manufacturing hub countering ASEAN plus China supply chains, how can Washington strategically invest in India's PLI schemes and fabrication facilities to counter Southeast Asia's pull? I think this, in some way, I asked you what kind of incentives will US give. So I think you have addressed this in part, but if there's anything else you want to add, feel free. Yes, Lauren. So these two questions.
Excellent. So, the first question, and I really hope I'm understanding this right, but is, can India demand Chinese technology transfer in exchange for access to the Indian market? I think Yes, right. Like India, Chinese companies, with the support of Beijing, are looking to go abroad. They're looking as Chinese economic growth naturally begins to slow. They're looking for high growth markets, and so India, of course, is going to be one of them. And so, for example, to this question of like, if India eases restrictions on Chinese investment, will Chinese companies come? I think they absolutely will want to come. And I think that, there might be some examples where China restricts them, like prevents them from investing in India because of the strategic ambition, strategic interest in keeping critical supply chains in China. But I imagine, right, like usually these sorts of restrictions are not going to be on everything. You could still see Chinese companies very much so invest in India, given the opportunity here. On the second question, linking up India's PLI and other ambitions to develop manufacturing here with U.S. de-risking. This is exactly why I'm in India, actually. I think that there's a huge overlap in at least in ambitions at a high level between the sort of sectors the U.S. wants to de-risk, like electronics, and the sectors that India wants to expand manufacturing in part to create jobs, right? And so I think it's a question of making sure that U.S. tariff rates are kind of aligning, like, right, first and foremost, that like access to the U.S. market is going to be granted. We see this already, for example, in the smartphone case, where while most U.S. imports from India are subject to a 50% tariff. Smartphones are exempted, so which is facilitating the flow of Apple iPhones and so on. And I imagine you could see similar sort of exemptions precisely for the strategic sectors the U.S. is targeting with the Section 232 tariffs and those that are subject to the PLI. I'd imagine, for example, that pharmaceuticals, there would be there's a huge joint interest in expanding Indian pharmaceutical production and in particular reducing reliance on Chinese APIs. And so I think tariffs will be part of that, maybe through DFC or even just like encouraging U.S. companies to invest here. I think that will be there's a huge overlapping mutual interest there.
Thank you, Lauren. So, if there are no other questions, then I will pose a last question to end this session on, which is, we have spoken about critical supply chains, but there is also one more source of ambiguity in the same subject of supply chains, which comes from dual use. And I think the recent spat between China and Japan gave us a good glimpse into what China can do if it wants to tighten the screws on any country, so to speak. And this is not new because I think the law governing dual use has been around for some time in China. But this is maybe the first significant instance of operationalizing that and saying that we will not allow any dual use exports to go to Japan because of political reasons. So, my question is this: given that there is uncertainty in what US is doing vis-a-vis China and other countries to some extent, and there is China flexing its muscle and trying to weaponize export of technology, export of products, and so on. Is there a lesson here? Because I read somewhere that Japan has done a very good job of researching its vulnerabilities with China and building capacity. So is there something like that India can adopt? Approach which strikes a good balance in terms of you have of course said ease of business, but ease of business is such a nebulous idea that it's very difficult to generate bullet points from that. But is there something else that India can do in terms of building capacity to cope for this uncertain future? Uh, in terms of eliminating confusion on what is critical, what is dual use, what could China do? So, is there any insurance policy available? Is my answer, is my question, to mitigate against all this uncertainty. So, I think this can be your cue for concluding remarks. If there are no other questions, so please take a shot. Thank you, Laura.
Absolutely. I think the Japan example is a good one here. And we saw Japan try to de-risk before it was cool from China, in particular in these sort of like critical raw materials back starting in 2012 when China like first threatened to restrict the export of these products. And it's taken Japan, the sort of momentum behind these efforts are different today than back in 2012, but it still has taken Japan a significant period to get to where it is today. And Japan still remains, right? This is why we're talking about Chinese controls recently on dual use goods. Like Japan remains dependent on China for some of those products. And so, I mean, to be frank, so long as China is dominant across these supply chains, so long as China has 90% of global processing capacity for XYZ rare earth mineral, there isn't an insurance policy unless you can find a way to innovate these sort of products or these components out of your EV batteries or your MRI machines or so on. I mean, this is kind of a fanciful idea, right? This is going to be very hard to do, and I don't think that is the sort of like approach to take. And so I think instead the best sort of insurance policy, if India is looking to sort of reduce its exposure to Chinese export controls. This is something, there's a growing argument in the United States that like the only way that the U.S. and its partners can compete with China or can reduce this vulnerability is by creating enough of a sort of like not a unified market, but like several countries are going to be jointly willing to sort of pay a slight premium in order to develop sort of like alternative supply chains that could be sort of an insurance policy. And so I think that the best sort of insurance policy if India is going to try to protect itself from the China threat is going to be by kind of embedding itself within these efforts, by taking part in Pax Silica and trying to like align its, all the recent domestic rare earth minerals initiatives along with these sort of international ambitions to make sure that, we're not working at cross purposes. Of course, there's still sort of uncertainty in trade ties with the United States. And so, I understand that India, well, I think that India has significant, there's a ton that India could gain from being part of this sort of like ex-China, US oriented or like US groupings that include the United States. That of course, India maybe doesn't want to become too dependent on the United States market. And so I'd imagine that what we've already seen this over the past year, right? Like India, while it's looking to improve its relationship on trade with the United States, is also probably going to sign a trade deal with the EU quite soon. We saw trade deals last year with the UK, New Zealand, and others. And so I think that India is already trying to reduce its exposure or to prevent like being overly dependent on the US market by also opening up and deepening relations with these other countries as well. And so, I think that there's, I mean, India has like done quite a lot in that regard. And I guess just like the very last thing in terms of like the ways that India, yes, easy doing business is a very nebulous term. But at least from like my, and I'll be coming out with a paper on this probably in a few months. But I think that on specifically in the sort of ease of doing business that India's done a lot to make this better, but there's certain things like, for example, on like land acquisition, or like certain customs processes that are just like not quite integrated with the rest of the world. They're not, I don't think that there's like significant there's significant opportunity for India to improve ease of doing business in some of these areas in ways that, at least from my outsider perspective, and don't seem like too politically sensitive. Would definitely welcome. Actually, if anyone has any perspectives on this, would absolutely love to have a conversation. But like amending some old tax regulations. We've seen this is already happening at the moment, but I think that there's ways that India can modernize some of its systems and, kind of make them easier for foreign companies that want to support the development of not just final assembly, but the supplier ecosystems and so on in India in ways that are hugely beneficial for Indian employment prospects, for Indian GDP growth, and so on. So I think there's like significant room for growth there, and that wouldn't necessarily, prevent India from, trying to attain sort of strategic autonomy, whatever that sort of means. I hope this is helpful. Thank you so much.
Yes, Lauren, very helpful. Thank you for your time and the patience with which you stuck to the India questions. And we look forward to your paper on India, and also, you're getting comfortable with India. So we hope you keep getting opportunities to visit India, and we'll be happy to have you again on a next future edition of Wednesday seminar. And I wish you have a good remainder of your trip and travel to many cities in India. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's just a pleasure to be here with you guys.
Thank you, Lauren. Bye-bye. Thanks. Bye.
I now seek your permission to formally bring an end to today's session.
Sure, Anne. Sure, please.
Thank you, sir. With this, we come to an end of today's seminar. We thank Ms. Lauren Piper and Mr. Santosh Pai for gracing today's seminar with their presence and for giving us their precious time. We also thank the audience for joining us today. We would like to invite you to the upcoming Wednesday seminar. Further information regarding the event can be found on the ICS website. You may also subscribe to our newsletter for regular updates. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.